Throughout history there have been many leaders, or members of the monarchy which have been assassinated, but fewer have been executed by their own people. Charles I was the executed King of England, who lost his head on a cold January morning outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London. He had been condemned to die following his loss of the English Civil War, and powerful politicians such as Oliver Cromwell signed the King's death warrant. As the axe fell, taking his head clean off, there was an audible groan from the crowd that day, as many believed they had executed a man who had been sent by God to rule. But one man who ruled as the Emperor of Mexico was Maximilian I, who was also an Austrian Archduke. However, he was also executed alongside his generals in June 1867 in another act of regicide. Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Maximilian I of Mexico, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Maximilian was born an Archduke of Austria on the 6th of July 1832 in Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, Austria. He was the second of 5 children, and the second son of Archduke Franz Karl of Austria, who was the son of Emperor Franz I of Austria. Max's older brother would later go on to become the Emperor, and he was educated along with his brother Franz Joseph, who was 2 years older. They were taught by their governess, but then in 1836, Count Heinrich Bombeles was in charge of the boys' education, and he gave them a huge schedule where they were expected to study a large amount of time each week, even at a young age. Their vigorous schedule ranked up, and his brother at the age of 13 even became very ill because of the stress of his education. But things continued and got more intense, and Maximilian learned many languages, and he learned many languages associated with his European neighbouring countries. In 1852, Maximilian then served in the Austrian Navy, and during this he made a stopover in Portugal, where he met and became close with Princess Maria Amelia of Brazil, the daughter of Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. Their mothers were members of the Bavarian royal family, and they had met as children at a family reunion in Munich. The couple fell in love and were betrothed to each other, but their official engagement was never announced, as the princess died from tuberculosis in February 1853. This must have been very upsetting for Maximilian, and then 3 years later he met Princess Charlotte of Belgium, the daughter of Leopold I, the King of Belgium, and a first cousin of Queen Victoria of the UK. The couple fell in love and married at the Royal Palace of Brussels on the 27th of July 1857. The couple did not have children, but Maximilian was then appointed the Viceroy of the Kingdom of Lombardy, Venetia, following his brother's accession as the Emperor. But he was later sacked by his brother from this, as Maximilian was believed to have been too liberal, and the Austrians lost control of most of their land, but Maximilian and Charlotte retreated to Miramar Castle that they had built. But in 1859, the Mexican monarchists approached Maximilian to become the Emperor of Mexico, and he did not accept this to begin with. But following the French intervention in Mexico 2 years later, Maximilian changed his mind. Napoleon III, following the French capture of the Mexico City and a French staged referendum, confirmed that the people wanted an emperor, and Maximilian agreed to accept the crown. On the 10th of April 1864 in Miramar Castle, a Mexican delegation told him of the rest, and Maximilian said that he accepted the crown from the hands of the Mexican nation. He swore to promote prosperity, well-being and independence of the nation. It was a strange thing, as Maximilian was now an emperor like his brother. He landed at Veracruz with his wife, who was now called Empress Carlota. Veracruz was a liberal town, and the liberal voters were against having Maximilian as their emperor. He was backed by Mexican conservatists and Napoleon III, but he was in trouble from the start. The liberals were led by Benito Juarez, the former president, who had been deposed by the French, and they did not recognise his rule. There was warfare going on between the French and Juarez's forces that wanted a republic. Following the end of the American Civil War, the French withdrew their soldiers from Mexico, as the United States pressured them to do this. Following this, Maximilian could not hold out against the popular Juarez, as his request for help from Europe was not responded to. Charlotte, his wife, then went to Europe to ask Napoleon III and the Pope for help, but the only positivity she got was from the Pope, who said he would simply pray for her and her husband. Maximilian wanted to flee and leave Mexico, but he then received a letter from his mother, and he then remained and chose to stay, which was ultimately a foolish decision. He, along with his last soldiers, barricaded themselves inside of Querétaro, a city, but this was then besieged. The city fell on the 14th of May 1867, and the 34-year-old Maximilian was seized. His trial began on the 13th of June, and he was charged with conspiring to overthrow the Mexican government. His lawyers attempted to defend the legitimacy of his empire and rule, but the day after the court returned a verdict of guilty, and for this Maximilian was sentenced to death. There were heads of European countries and nations that sent telegrams and letters requesting for his life to be spared, but this was not listened to. Juarez, despite respecting Maximilian on a personal level, refused to commute the death sentence because he believed it was necessary to send a message that Mexico would not allow any foreign interventions and European powers to muscle in on their affairs. There was a plan devised to allow Maximilian to escape his execution by bribing his guards. However, he chose not to go through with this plan unless a couple of his generals would go with him. Also, he believed that shaving his beard to avoid recognition would undermine his dignity if he was to be recaptured. However, the execution was carried out in the Cerro de las Campanas at 6:40 a.m. in the morning of the 19th of June 1867. Maximilian, along with two of his generals, were brought out from their prison cells. Maximilian spoke in Spanish to the executioners, and he gave each of them a gold coin, as if giving them a reward to his executioner, to almost make sure that the execution went well and straightforward. In the past, particularly during the Tudor period, as people were facing the executioner's axe, they would often give the executioner a reward to make sure that death was performed in one swift blow and was not botched. Maximilian's final words were, "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be spilled, end the bloodshed which has been experienced in my new motherland. Long live Mexico, long live its independence." The firing squad were then given the order to fire, and quickly Maximilian I of Mexico was executed, along with two of his generals. Following his execution, he was then embalmed, and his body was placed on display in Mexico. But then the following year, an Austrian admiral, Wilhelm von Tegethoff, was sent to Mexico to bring Maximilian's body back to Austria. It arrived back and was taken to Vienna, where it was placed inside the imperial crypt on the 17th of January 1868. A memorial chapel was constructed on a hill where the execution took place. But Maximilian I of Mexico is a rather interesting figure, and some historians have said that he genuinely wanted to help the people of Mexico, and he was brave as he refused to desert his loyal followers. But others claim he was rather naive and unaware of the political landscape of the country he became the emperor of. But he was a man who ultimately met a brutal end, thousands of miles away from where he was born and his homeland, and his execution at the end of a firing squad was considered rather brutal. His wife, after his death, lived for another 60 years, but she fell into a state of insanity after his execution. It's likely that her upset was caused by this. He was an archduke who probably did not belong in Mexico. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.